welcome to In Search of Black Power. I'm Lawrence Grand Prix, Director of Research for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle.
I'm Rasheem, independent researcher and scholar.
The question for today is homeownership an effective tool for Black wealth creation and Black community empowerment? So the Brookings Institute, which is a think tank in D.C., says in 2019, white wealth was approximately 8 times that of Black wealth, and we know that has expanded during the pandemic. So for literally centuries, when it comes to the question of Black wealth creation, there's really been one central answer for Black folks, which has been homeownership. So there's an increasing movement that helped prompt us to have this conversation, which is people talking about this concept of buying back the block. There are hip-hop songs about it. There are lots of rappers talking about it. And the theory, in a nutshell, is that white folks don't value our communities, which actually produces an opportunity for people to buy up our communities, given that the home values are relatively low. And where it starts to get political, and we have a broader conversation, is another part of how many people make the argument, which is we're spending a bunch of money on frivolous stuff. Sneakers, Jordans, Xboxes, and if we save up that money, it'll be better used buying up real estate, which we then can use as an asset of wealth creation. And because we own the block, that will increase Black community empowerment. So there are folks on YouTube who, and I was actually surprised, are talking about this and actually talking about the concept, which is the retort or response that people hear, which is this is just Black gentrification. And being frank and honest about explaining their argument to being called Black gentrifiers and really defending their buyback the Black argument, even in the face of that Black gentrification argument.
Yeah. And largely seeing it as like, this is a positive, this is the move, this is the way to counter it, even though a lot of the things that they're promoting and suggesting are doing the very same thing as white gentrifiers.
So yeah, Fifth Ward is the next gentrifying area. There's a lot of redevelopment going on, and it's one of those things where I always tell people, look, it's going to happen either way. So you either participate in it and try to control the narrative, control what's being built, the price points, or you watch it happen and you complain about it. When I was just doing fix and flip, I saw the same thing happening. I heard everybody complaining all the time, and I was like, well, why isn't anybody stepping up, actually trying to get in this game and control what's going on? And if you can't control all of it, whatever little impact you have helps. And hopefully what I'm doing will encourage other people to get in the game and start doing redevelopment themselves.
Yeah, I think one of the things that the guy in the video is Senegal. I think one of the things that he's like largely missing is the impact that it has on displacement. Like his thing is, oh, why not? It's a good thing. It's redevelopment and that sort of thing. But I think there's a really key piece missing there when the only thing that we're saying is, oh, we're creating more homes. And you see in that video, he has these 2 homes that looks like they probably shot up. You know what I mean? The cost of living in that area. And I think that's just a piece that's missing. And I think it's not that type of action is more individualistic thinking, more capitalist thinking, and like this is good for me, and it increases the amount of money that I make, but not really seeing the impact that it has on the community. Also, I don't believe lives in that community from what I got. He gets the houses and then he flips them. So he's essentially doing the very same thing. The only thing is he has Black skin while he's doing it.
So I think he's in Houston. I'm not sure what part of Houston he lives in, but the thing that grabbed me was the inevitability argument, which is, well, either we do it or they do it.
Right.
Now, the question I think needs to be asked is, does it work at all for Black folks? Because if it worked for us, then maybe it'd be worth arguing. But does it work for Black folks? And what brought me to that conversation was a book that was written by a Emory University professor, Emory's in Atlanta, named Dorothy Brown, called The Whiteness of Wealth: How the Tax System Impoverishes Black Americans and How We Can Fix It. So there are some really interesting and provocative nuggets of information specifically tied to housing that I think would be useful to share and be useful to talk about. So I'm going to read a quote from the book that really explains her argument around why the tax system makes it so that white folks might benefit from homeownership in terms of wealth creation, but Black folks less so. So the first quote goes like this. Roger Lowenstein describes the mortgage interest deduction as an American folk legend Reagan promised we will preserve the American dream, which the home mortgage interest deduction symbolizes. Such language reinforces the idea that the tax break was a key ingredient of the American dream of homeownership, even though it was not an ingredient evenly distributed amongst black and white homeowners. As the percentage of black population increases, property value goes down and the rate of appreciation in values goes down. If one area has a much higher white population, the prices are going to be 2 or 3 times what they are in black areas with a similar economic infrastructure. Taxpayers have a choice. Take the standard deduction and don't itemize, or itemize deductions if doing so will lower your tax bill even further. If you are entitled to a traditional mortgage interest deduction for up to $100,000 in home equity loans if the proceeds are used to improve a home, a taxpayer can only reap these benefits by choosing to itemize that. A recent analysis of the IRS statistics says that only 22% of tax returns claim deductions related to home mortgage interest. The Tax Policy Center predicts that the increase in the standard deduction means that only 10% of Americans will itemize their deductions going forward. So just to summarize, we hear all the time, white folks are making all this money in tax breaks off of the mortgage. You need to stop renting and get a mortgage.
Right.
Well, this is saying that if you actually look at the tax law, only 22%, really the highest 22% of earners are getting anything from that mortgage tax deduction, because for most people it makes more sense to take the standard deduction. You're actually losing money if you stop taking the standard deduction and take the mortgage interest rate deduction. So this goes back to the whole accepted wisdom YouTubers about, smart money is not paying rent, they're using interest and getting tax breaks. That's only the case, according to the experts, for the top 22% in the past. Now only 10% that's going to make sense for. So just to continue, because there's even more tax law that kind of debunks the myths of black home ownership being a wealth creation tool. Now, the other politics and the other social stuff we can get to later. When it comes to wealth, there are more tax arguments that she's making that explains the complexity and the reality of this. So she continues. The mortgage interest deduction is what most people think of when they think of how the government subsidizes homeownership. It's not the only subsidy the government offers homebuyers. Congress allowed homeowners to sell their residences without paying any tax on the gains. Personal assets, like your personal residence, are not eligible for loss deductions. So if you sell your home at a loss, no deduction for you. Another insidious factor remained. White Americans are still not interested in buying in racially diverse neighborhoods. Studies show that the average black homeowner lives in a neighborhood that is 51% black, and the average white homeowner lives in a neighborhood that's 80% white. This is why homeownership is not a straightforward wealth builder for black families, because the only guaranteed return on their investment is to buy in a community where there will be a small and vulnerable minority. She concludes, as value rose for black homeowners, their property tax bill doubled from 2017 to 2018. At the same time, their home insurance company terminated their policy in the fall of 2018 because they couldn't afford to replace the roof. Now, she and her husband, who are black, respectively a janitor and a line cook, are being told their house is too run down to insure, but at the same time it's worth twice as much as they bought it for. Black homeowners and their neighbors get financially hurt because of the decisions of white homeowners make. When neighborhoods remain predominantly black, the housing stock has lower value, and the school is likely to be underfunded and underperforming. When neighborhoods go through a gentrification process, white families move in, and the housing increases in value, black and lower middle-income homeowners, like the Hancocks, face skyrocketing tax bills. Either way, black families lose.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that you brought up earlier, when we're talking about it reminds me of just basically the ways in which buying into the American dream, so to speak, and also it speaks to me of like this very strong push for financial literacy, right? Like how you said, like the acknowledged wisdom of the time. You need to buy a home. You need to do these certain things. They're just like certain key things when it comes to financial literacy. But it's almost like we're just financially literate enough, but not necessarily having that racial lens. And the thing that I appreciate about this book and us like engaging with it is because it looks at that financial literacy and it puts that racial lens on it so that we could see some of the ways in which some of our very same activiis that we're doing, that white folks are doing, are not benefiting us in the ways. In fact, there's some that could be even argued to disadvantage us. one of the ones that that stand out for me that is just like easier to point to is the way in which, like how you just mentioned, home ownership values, how it appreciates, and we're not buying homes in some of those same neighborhoods that the white folks are buying homes in. So, you know, how does that work out? And one of the things too that I learned recently, also from reading, just from reading her book, because I didn't know it before, is that marriage taxes and how that shows up and works, and how if you are a homeowner and you are married, you get that marriage tax credit if the other person in your home is not then working.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's that really makes me think about this like cult of domesticity, or this cult of true womanhood that just reinforces this reliance on a male breadwinner. Not it doesn't necessarily explicitly say male breadwinner, but it's a concept and an idea that I feel like middle to upper class white folks kind of lean toward. Now, a lot of black homes, I know in the black homes that I grew up in, where there were two parents or two adults, everybody earned. So they wouldn't benefit from that. Like, marriage and families are set up in a particular way in communities of colors that is not set up in white homes and institutions. And it's like it benefits and advantages them.
Yes.
In that
So
way.
the thing that I think makes it hard for people to understand what's happening here is that the impulse is to say, well, I don't care what white people value.
Yeah.
I don't care what white people want. We need to value our own. And we can move millions of dollars doing that, but we can't move trillions. And markets run off of trillions of dollars.
Right.
And white people's preferences, because they have the wealth, move that at a much higher degree. And government preferences in terms of tax bills are actually able to move market valuations in a way that, it's not that black folks are any way deficient, we just literally don't have the money to compete, to be able to force the market to value our communities the same way. Right? So just to kind of encapsulate some examples. I think some of the things we're talking about can feel really abstract. So I just wanted to run through some examples of how this would look materially on the ground for a black family and a white family in Baltimore. Okay. So let's say you have the mortgage deduction in a white family and a black family. White family's living in Roland Park.
Okay.
They're living in a row home, you know, but because it's Roland Park, a desirable white neighborhood in the city of Baltimore, they're going to get like a $500,000 mortgage. Right, so basically, do a little bit of math. They're paying around $1,500-ish a month, which is going to add up to $28,000 a year in mortgage. Right, the black family living in a row home, but it's in downtown Winchester. It's valued less, $200,000 mortgage, and that equals up to about $7,200 a year in mortgage. So if you look at the tax system, the standard deduction, what you get automatically, is $12,500, which means that by itemizing their mortgage, the white family gets a $14,500 tax break. And because of the magical mortgage interest rate deduction that we're told to get, black family gets nothing. Yeah. They would lose money if they took the mortgage deduction because they would have to give up the standard deduction. So this is the argument that the book is making, that if you look at the reality of black life, some of this financial common sense is common only to the common condition for middle-class white folks, who the tax system is written for.
Right.
And so along with that, because one thing that really got me was depreciation, and how white folks, because other white people want to live near each other, their homes appreciate because they have enough wealth to move the market. So you have that same white family, that $500,000 home in Roland Park. I mean, look at prices now. They've been skyrocketing all pandemic. Let's just project it goes up to $750,000, $750,000, and they only pay taxes on the original $500,000 because they didn't want to punish people for their homes appreciating in value if they sell the home. Right. So that means that they're able to bank that $250,000 tax-free. Right. Black family, unfortunately, look at something like the Highway to Nowhere, my grandmother's house, North Arlington Street, right above the Highway to Nowhere. And racist policy like that means that black families' homes often depreciate in value.
Right, and they sell at a loss.
Exactly. So let's just imagine that black family in that row home bought it at $200, depreciates to $100. Very common thing. They get nothing for trying to access the American dream. The tax system, which benefited the white family, gives them no benefit at all for being a victim of the racism of the American market. So the last thing that I want to point out is that this is often a lose-lose for black homeowners. So let's say that you have a home that you buy in Sandtown, Winchester.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what happens often is that even when your home depreciates in value, you oftentimes actually get appraised at a higher value than the market will bear. So you're actually paying more property taxes than your home's actually worth, which the city loves because they get all that property tax money. But you're paying extra property taxes compared to what your home's actually worth. But let's say somehow you actually get to, PG County, and your home is a solid middle-class home that actually begins to appreciate in value. You're not going to get nearly the appreciation because we know appraisers are racist. So if you actually look at the tear sheets here, it's been proven that in lower-class neighborhoods, they're getting appraised even higher than what they're worth and paying more property taxes. But in upper-class neighborhoods, black homes are not nearly appraising as highly as white homes are. So at either end of the spectrum, the ability to use home ownership as a wealth creation tool has really been limited. So that kind of gets to some of the conversation I wanted to have with you. If it's not working for us, why is there such a deep sentimental attachment to this concept of home ownership?
I think not only is it sentimental, I think it's very emotional. I think there's ways in which, of course, Black people have definitely bought into the American dream. I also think that there's this way in which, particularly for respectable Negroes, as I like to refer to them, there is this: if white people do it, then this must be what I should do. Also, I think there's a way in which financial literacy does not have that racial lens that the author here is providing for us. So people are just not tapped in and just don't, just don't necessarily know. And it's interesting the different viewpoints that folks can take on it, especially with the types of, I feel like the language that we use. Even when we talk about things like gentrification, people use gentrification and redevelopment, and they use them like they're synonymous terms. And so it makes people question, is gentrification bad? Maybe it's not bad. It's our neighborhood looks cute. We have a nice new building. We have a new Starbucks over here. Is that bad? And I think it's so much in the language that we use. Instead of saying something like, is gentrification bad, if we said more or less, is displacement bad for Black communities, you would get a different response. If we said, is erasure of culture, of Black culture, is that bad for communities? Is disinvestment bad? I think sometimes it's in the language and the marketing, and I think that the white owning class has gotten really good at crafting language to make their argument sound good and to make buying into what they have sound good. And we also, again, financial literacy is not enough. We need more than financial literacy. We need this racial lens, and we need to change the system, because if not, we're just buying into that same system. Just like Senegal in the video earlier, it's like, if we don't do it, they're going to do it. Exactly. And then the earlier clip, the Rick Ross video, Buying Back the Block. It's like, that's promoted and that's praised, because I think a lot of folks feel like, you know what, they believe in this Jared Ball's book,
The Myth of Black Buying Power.
Yeah, The Myth of Black Buying Power. So there's this way in which we are taught or socialized to buy into capitalism. And you hear it in the rap songs. I'm going to buy this, I'm going to spend this, I'm going to, I think that there's this way in which you have made it when you have owned a home, the more things you possess. And I think that there's a very strong emotional connection to that, especially if you haven't had anything.
Absolutely. And the idea of inevitability comes in. Because the idea is that the government's never going to do anything for us. And we just normalize that it's a waste of time to think about public housing, to think about redistributive policy. Because the only thing we've ever seen move is what we made move in the market. The reality of the limitations of that are irrelevant if you've normalized that's literally the only thing that's possible. And so I think we have to be very clear that there are mechanisms of local governance that you can pull, that you can band together politically to push the cities and push the governments to make investments in redevelopment that isn't gentrification. And I think having a distinction isn't easy. But to me, the distinction is redevelopment invests in the capacity and the institutions of the people that are already there.
Yes, that part.
So that they're able to become stable enough to own their own community, which is distinct from gentrification, because that focuses on the institutions, that focuses on a comprehensive thinking about people's economic status, while gentrification focuses primarily on the housing stock. And what it does is that it improves the housing stock, either formally or informally for new people to come in.
Right.
So if you're improving the housing stock without directly tying to political struggles locally to improve the conditions for people on the ground, then I think that's more gentrification. Because the idea is that if you improve the conditions for people on the ground, improving the housing stock will be a natural outgrowth of that investment. So people tend to go, what looks sexy, what feels like it's moving, feels dynamic, is build new stuff.
Yeah.
Where if you actually built up people and communities, the new stuff would come as a natural outgrowth of that. So that distinction is something we're probably going to have to bore out in further episodes. We can do an entire episode just on this.
Yeah, definitely.
But on financial literacy, because like you said, I think there is this notion that we're spending our money frivolously. And the reality is folks just don't have enough money. And Jared Ball talks a lot about this. But similarly, while financial literacy is not a political movement that can solve wealth inequality in of itself, it shouldn't be entirely demonized as a survival strategy. As we build the larger political movements, we need to shift resources. So Dr. Brown actually talks about some financial advice she gives to homeowners, which is one of the reasons I wanted to do this book. It's very interesting and provocative, but I think it's demonstrative of something that I think is really important to talk about. So she writes in her book to prospective home buyers who are black, quote, "While we are working towards systemic change, what do we do in the meantime? There are steps both black and white taxpayers can take starting today to improve the circumstances of black Americans. In our current system, if you are a black American, the best way to get ahead is either by aligning your behaviors with white preferences and practices, or by listening to your own preferences but taking precautions. If you choose to mimic white behaviors, do not expect to have the same freedom of choice that your white peers have. If you're buying a home, never spend your maximum housing budget in a predominantly black neighborhood. You simply won't get a good return on your investment. That also makes home equity loans riskier, so avoid those as much as possible in predominantly black or diverse neighborhoods. Either spend less in a diverse neighborhood, making sure that you have disposable income remaining to invest in retirement, 529 plans, or stocks after your mortgage payments, or use your full budget to buy a smaller home in a white neighborhood. If you do this, your home value will likely grow, though your day-to-day experience might involve more of the racism triage we discussed."
I think that last point that you made, that whole section right there, was so powerful in terms of, one, the comparison she makes between, like, basically, if you do the same thing these white folks doing, just know it's not going to pan out the exact same for you. And that last part about buying, being house poor or house rich. Could you say that part again?
Which part in particular?
Well, you were saying how either don't spend all of your money basically buying your house in a poor...
If you're buying a home, never spend your maximum housing budget in a predominantly black neighborhood. Either spend less in a diverse neighborhood, making sure you have disposable income remaining to invest in other stuff. Or... buy a smaller home in a white neighborhood.
Right. I feel like that's speaking volumes.
I mean, it's a tough pill to swallow because she's actually, and this is something that is a core tenet of why I wanted to do this show. We have a lot, because this book is about anti-racism. It's about fighting racist power. But she doesn't have the same play that an Ibram X. Kendi gets, or some of the other white folks that talk about whiteness get. And, you know, I think Ibram X. Kendi did write a blurb for her book, which is good, but this is a tough pill to swallow. But this is actually asking people to observe the world as it is and being honest about the tough choices we have to make in the world as it is. That's actually not how you really get ahead in the academy or the publishing industry.
Right.
You tell people what they want to hear or what you think they want to hear. And that's how you get ahead. Because again, some people would call this defeatist. It's like, oh, you can't spend money in black neighborhoods. It's like, no, I'm going to tell you the truth so you can have a realistic expectation of what you're going to face making this choice. And I would say that you need to do political organizing to improve your communities because they will be devalued because how we know how the markets work.
Right. So
this kind of like just real pragmatic advice is an example of a book that's really written to black people. That's not demonizing their choice to live in a black neighborhood or a white neighborhood. But it says that either way, I'm going to take that advice seriously and tell you what's really going down. Right. And that's not what we have with most anti-racist texts. We have a lot of hyperbole. We have a lot of, people who just want to find a victim and blame them. But this sort of practical advice, it's important not to demonize it just because it's tough to hear.
Yeah.
It's actually really important that we promote scholars who are willing to tell these difficult truths, and not in a defeatist way, but in a realistic way.
I think the really important part, too, is one, coupling this might not be the way to do it, but also providing alternatives so that folks know there is a way to make this work for you, and also having all of that information laid out for them. I think something also that you mentioned earlier, when you were talking about the differences, just going in more detail about the differences between gentrification and redevelopment. And there are ways to do redevelopment that is not gentrifying. Mm-hmm. Because I think sometimes people hear it initially and they're just like, up in arms, upset, frustrated. And also, Black intellectuals are the most notably pessimistic people. but you in your examples, and also her, as she's talking in the book, are providing a better way. Alternatives.
Speaking of that better way, we can jump to her conclusion,
mm-hmm.
and then we can get to conclusions of our own,
sure.
right? Because she's talking about federal policy.
Mm-hmm.
We want to talk more about folks who are working on the ground locally every day. What are some pragmatic things you can do to take this knowledge and move it forward in your community? Mm-hmm. But she does have conclusions that she comes to specific around federal policy. Mm-hmm. So this is the last thing I'll read from her book. Quote, homeownership in America is a bad deal for most Black Americans. I propose we revise all home ownership subsidies to target them directly to those living in neighborhoods that are undervalued because of the race of their occupant. Those neighborhoods deserve government tax subsidies because the government's original discrimination against Black Americans gave rise to the current discrimination perpetuated by white homebuyers. What would be allowed is to tie all home ownership subsidies to neighborhoods and neighborhood wealth. If you compare neighborhood median wealth to citywide median wealth, you can legally create subsidies that exclusively go to home buyers in neighborhoods below the citywide median. As part of a neighborhood-based subsidy policy, you could also tie in deductions for home sale losses in these neighborhoods. The racial wealth gap means that my proposal will likely apply to the majority of Black homeowners who live in racially diverse neighborhoods, as well as the residents of some all-white neighborhoods in poor rural areas. From my perspective, that makes the neighborhood-based subsidy a less than ideal solution, but it's potentially the most politically and legally viable. I'd partner these subsidies with one new tax break, allowing losses on the sale of homes to be fully deductible, just as investors are allowed to deduct their losses if their stock portfolio takes a hit. Finally, she concludes, the symbolic attachment to the mortgage deduction and other tax subsidies for homeownership is powerful, and is the message that homeownership is an unqualified good for all. I think of my mother and her prayer that they'd get the house on Morris Avenue and Mary Hancock's refrain from her subsidized rental apartment in Nashville, one day I'm going to have me a house. In truth, homeownership in America is rigged and has been from the beginning. Is it worth it? Should Black Americans try to grab this piece of the American dream, or should we understand that it will never work for us in the same way as it works for white homeowners? The answer to both questions is yes, but a qualified yes.
Yeah.
So I think that that's just really gets to the emotional attachment folks have. Because that's one thing that I think is really important is that, again, this is an author who is taking the question seriously. Mm-hmm. Because what some authors literally say is just give reparations for Black folks. Mm-hmm. Problem is, that's unconstitutional. And what does that even mean? That's a good talking point if you want to sell books. That's not a policy I can take to a lawmaker and have them pass. So I just really wanted to give her respect and just to show the difference between this text and other texts you might be seeing that's going to take that, we just need to rise up and overcome, right. More general emotive solution. It's like, no. The solution is based on wealth. And yet, some gentrifiers will probably benefit and some white folks will benefit, but that's actually going to pass constitutional muster. Like, these are the types of scholars we need to be promoting more in our community because they're telling us pragmatic information that we can actually use. And again, we at LBS are doing policy, so I just appreciated her approaching it from a policy perspective.
Love that. I think too, to the other point that you were referencing that she mentioned, or maybe it was directly from you, around reparations, and whether or not it'll pass. Even if it did pass, right? If the system is set up to advantage white wealth. It's still, we're just still moving, at that point, we're just moving money around.
Yeah.
If the system
I mean,
is set up in that way.
reparations has, in many cases, unfortunately come to only mean funding basically the white nonprofit industrial complex to do more services for black people. That's certainly not my definition of reparations, but that's what I think you're getting at. If you just say that, you're not providing any concrete examples of things that you can actually do. So I think one concrete example is people talk a lot about the physical markers of gentrification, but I think one concrete thing that you can do is focus on the political institutions that you need to invest in to fight gentrification. Because I think back to Harold Cruz and his book, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. He was arguing that the Harlem Renaissance was really important because these were black independent creators producing, in many ways, what one could call African-centered art and independent black art, but it happened outside of a larger political movement for black folks to own Harlem. And if black folks wanted to continue the Harlem Renaissance, would have needed to have turned that artistic movement into a political movement around black ownership of Harlem, so we could have the cultural containers we needed to continue to do the cultural and political work. So I look at things like the Black Arts District here in Baltimore, which is an actual political institution designed to foster black creatives. They're trying to build a building, but the political institution in itself is trying to give resources to black folks, engage in political fights, and focusing on the political institutions, not just the buildings, right? Because people start seeing the buildings go up, it's too late, right? So actually taking that institution building as seriously as we take building buildings. So along with that, I think another good thing that you can take away from this, and you can actually bring up the tear sheet for this now if you could. Whether you agree with gentrification or not, we don't control the markets. Some of this stuff is likely to happen in many cities. So whether you are pushing black folks to buy the block or not, we need to take seriously tying in local law that makes it so that legacy businesses and homeowners are not priced out because of the rising property taxes. So you look at a city like DC, property taxes are going through the roof. And if you have a building you own in DC, you may have been paying a certain amount of property taxes in the 90s, and that could double, triple, quadruple right now. So the example is Holly Garima, it's a black filmmaker, owns a bookstore, cafe in DC called Sankofa, which is right next to Howard University, a cultural staple of DC. They were faced with eviction because they could not pay their property tax bill.
Because they're right in it.
Because they're right in the midst of this highly desirable neighborhood in DC.
Right.
Now, of course, Sankofa has huge social, cultural capital in DC. So they were able to go to their city council people and say, hey, can you basically grandfather us in, give us some property tax abatement? But not everybody is Sankofa. Not everybody's Holly Garima.
Right.
And there are lots of grandmothers, grandfathers, business owners in these communities that are going to be severely hurt when these increase in property taxes come in. So you have to have a system. So you don't need to just do a one-on-one deal with a lawmaker to help you abate your property taxes. There has to be systemic property tax abatement for anyone who is a legacy owner in these communities. And again, that's something you can really concretely take to whoever in your community.
Yeah. I think one of the things that makes me think about, too, as we talk about housing and gentrification, a conversation that I was overhearing recently where folks were talking about whether or not once black people have made it, right, should they stay in black neighborhoods or should they leave? Like, what is more beneficial? Should people stay or should people leave? I think I really, really appreciate Dr. Brown's response in should you do this or should you do this? And the answer to both is yes, but a qualified yes. Like, what does staying there look like? How are you actually investing? And then to your point earlier, paying attention to the political machine before the buildings go up, before there's these other changes and that sort of thing.
I mean, you can stay in the hood, but the goal is to make the hood not
right,
the hood
like
no more.
Right, exactly.
And the thing that people, I think, miss with that is the very fact of you being there is not enough.
Right.
So you need to think about the larger political dynamics of who gets funded, how's the public funding flow, what institutions exist, and be willing to engage in those fights for the community that's already there.
Right.
So that they can become stabilized and build their own institutions. Like, again, in Maryland, they're going to legalize cannabis in 2022, right? And that's going to produce, when the industry is mature, between $50 and $100 million per year in tax revenue. So making sure that tax revenue is reinvested in the communities impacted by the war on drugs, that's how you make the hood no longer as hoodish as it has been. It's not just building new buildings and moving people in. Because then you're just going to move those poor people out of that neighborhood, and they're going to do hood stuff wherever they go. Right. So you just literally disperse the hood. You think of the example of Hopkins. Hopkins had a huge redevelopment in central East Baltimore, Middle East. And a lot of people say that they basically just bought up buildings and let them rot to decrease the property value, to make it easier for them to buy up even more stuff.
Yeah.
The people that live there, a lot of them moved to Northeast Baltimore. And the murder rate in Northeast Baltimore has skyrocketed. Because these are people who, again, no alternatives to the street economy, no legitimate compensation for being kicked out of that neighborhood. They're doing what they got to do, but now they're on somebody else's territory.
I think that's a good point to bring up the ways in which communities are divested from, right? To set up and make it right for things like gentrification, make it right for being able to push people out of certain neighborhoods.
Exactly. And again, it's really easy to blame those folks who were there. And even when you try to help them, if you're helping them in a way that assumes they can't help themselves, the idea of giving them resources to help themselves will be foreign to you.
Yeah.
So being sure that they're not getting resources that flows through the same people that caused the problem, i.e. the Johns Hopkinses and the white nonprofit industrial complex. But the dynamics of institutional investment and ensuring bottom-up grassroots investment in folks who have legitimacy on the ground, that's going to have to be a topic for another episode.
Yeah.
So we thank you, appreciate you all, and we hope to see you next time we continue to go in search of Black power. See you soon.
See you.